So we're going to take you through the backgrounds, the methods, the results, and discussion of the research, and just a general overview of it. We're going to start out with talking about what is Parkinson's. And this is actually a very important question because this is where a lot of the mainstream research, perhaps I don't think quite gets it right. In Parkinson's, the hallmark of this condition is the loss of neurons. And the neurons are lost throughout the body. And something's killing them, or somehow they're dying, and we don't know why. You get this happening in neurons of the brain, of course, but it also happens in the neurons of the gut. There are many neurons in the gut. There are neurons in the nerves that innervate your bladder and your heart and other internal organs too. And they all get attacked or somehow die off in this condition. There are also these things called Lewy bodies. And that's the little thing I've circled in black. That's a neuron, the whole cell there. And the Lewy body is that little gray clump of protein that is in there, and it shouldn't be there, and it is there in Parkinson's. Okay. Now, the Lewy body has often been blamed and targeted as the problem in Parkinson's by many studies. And actually, we don't really know what they're doing, and to me it's like a fire truck being at a fire. Well, just because the fire truck tends to be at the fire doesn't mean that it caused the fire. Okay? It might be just hanging out, or it might be actually doing something to put the fire out. So we have to just be very careful with Lewy bodies, which tend to be present in Parkinson's. However, they're not always present, and that's another thing against them. There are areas of the brain that are, where neurons are being lost, and yet these Lewy bodies are not seen. So that, to me, says perhaps the Lewy body isn't the ultimate cause of the condition. And actually, there are some studies suggesting that the neurons of the Lewy bodies actually are the ones that are a little bit hardier and survive longer. And so that wouldn't really make sense. If the Lewy body was damaging neurons, you'd expect those cells to die off quicker. So we're just going to leave Lewy bodies alone for a bit. We're going to stick with defining Parkinson's as a disease of neurons all over the body where neurons are lost. And again, we don't know what does it. What we do know, though, is that this neuron loss seems to start in certain areas. On the bottom right, I've got a diagram of a brain, and then below it, a nose and a gut. The neurons in the nose, the neurons for smell, and the neurons in the gut, that's called the enteric nervous system, they seem to be affected very early on in this condition, years or even decades before the tremor is diagnosed. And this is why in Parkinson's, often the first symptom is not the tremor. The first symptom is often a loss of smell or constipation, and that occurs years or decades before you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, with the tremor or the slowness. Okay, so this condition, whatever is killing the neurons, it hits the neurons for smell and in the gut hard and early. It then seems to spread from the gut, anyways, up to the brainstem, and at that point, that's where the tremor center gets hit, the substantia nigra. And then the cortex gets hit last. The cortex is the little envelope of neurons around the perimeter of the brain, and that's where the memories are stored. So that's why memories and things don't get hit in Parkinson's. If they do get hit, they get hit at the very end. It's not like Alzheimer's. Okay? So Parkinson's is a lot more than just the tremor and the slowness and whatnot. It's a disease of neurons. It's not just a disease of substantia nigra. This is important because this explains many of the symptoms. Now, in medical school, I learned, and everyone learns, that there are 4 cardinal symptoms of Parkinson's. There are only 4. And tremor is one of them, that very typical tremor. Also this thing called bradykinesia, which technically means slowness. But in Parkinson's, it's more, when the neurologist asks you to do this tapping test, it's more than just slowness they're looking at. We want to see actually if you're reducing in amplitude as you do it. So you'll start out good, and then gradually it'll get smaller. That's what is specific for Parkinson's, that bradykinesia. Starts out big. You can do a fist. Probably most of you have done this, and then it starts to get smaller. That's what we're looking for. There's a lot of things that will make it slow, but only Parkinson's will make it go down. So that's the second symptom. The third symptom is gait instability, so you have difficulty walking, and then the fourth one is stiffness or rigidity. And these symptoms probably relate in some way, shape, or form to this, again, this little substantia nigra area of neurons in the brainstem, and that is what we learned about Parkinson's in med school, and perhaps what you've been told as well. But there's a lot more to it. Because it affects neurons everywhere, you get a lot more than those 4 motor symptoms. You get all these non-motor symptoms, and the non-motor symptoms are very important because here's the rest of your brain and nervous system, okay? You can see all the nerves that go to the gut and the heart and the lungs and the skin and the bladder. Everything gets innervated by neurons pretty much, and this disease is affecting all those neurons. So if you get the gut neurons affected, you get bloating, constipation, and again, they're hit hard early on. That's why a lot of people have constipation for even decades before the Parkinson's starts. If the autonomic neurons get affected, well, those that go to your bladder, those go to your heart. So if bladder, you might get some bladder problems, nocturia, where you have incontinence throughout the night. And if your heart's affected, well, it may not be able to beat fast when you stand up, and so you get dizzy when you stand up. Postural hypotension. That's part of the Parkinson's. And the rest of the brain neurons result in all these myriad symptoms: insomnia, fatigue, depression, anxiety. These are very common. Sleep disorders. An REM sleep disorder where you talk in your sleep, punch out, kick out in your sleep, that affects possibly everyone with Parkinson's to a certain degree, and it comes on very early too. In fact, people who are diagnosed with this REM sleep disorder and don't have Parkinson's, they're now getting referred to neurologists because we're so sure that they're probably going to get Parkinson's. Okay, so you can see all the caution signs there. The whole nervous system gets hit by Parkinson's. Whatever's killing the neurons, it hits the whole thing, not just that little substantia nigra. And these non-motor symptoms are a real problem. They're a real problem because they dominate the quality of life more and more as the Parkinson's progresses. You might start out with a tremor, but as the Parkinson's goes on, these non-motor symptoms, the fatigue, the daytime sleepiness, the cognitive impairment at the end, the bladder problems, depression, anxiety, apathy, all these things, these are what really affect quality of life at the end. And these are the problems. These become a real problem. The tremor can get worse too, but when you look at quality of life, studies show that it's not the tremor, it's not the motor symptoms that impair quality of life ultimately. So that's the non-motor symptoms. And the other problem with them is, of course, many of them do not respond well to levodopa. Some of them do. You can improve sleep pretty well with levodopa. Some of the pain syndromes respond pretty well. But when I get someone in the office and the main complaint is bladder or fatigue or cognitive impairment or something like that, some of the pain syndromes, my heart sinks a little bit because I know that it's going to be difficult for the medications to make those better. And then we start referring to other specialists for help, and we try different things, but it's difficult. Okay, so there's 2 facts about Parkinson's beyond the fact that it's a disease of neurons. There's 2 more I would like to impress upon you. The first is this concept of the gut-brain axis. The gut-brain axis is this communication between your brain, the neurons in your gut, the enteric nervous system, and the bacteria that live in the gut. Okay? And they all sort of talk to each other via chemicals and via nerves, particularly this big nerve that innervates the whole gut called the vagus nerve, and it goes right up to the brainstem, very close to where the substantia nigra is. Direct connection. Almost direct. Now, the enteric nervous system is a lot of neurons, 500 million, in the gut. And they actually produce a lot of dopamine, perhaps half of the dopamine, 50% of the dopamine in your body is produced by the gut. It is really affected early in Parkinson's. Constipation affects, is a symptom of a disturbed gut, and it occurs very early, as I mentioned before. In fact, by the time you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, it seems that most, up to 90% of the neurons in the gut, the dopamine neurons, are already lost. The gut is hit really hard in this condition. And you have this gut microbiota living right beside the gut nervous system. Some people call it the gut brain, the enteric nervous system. There's a trillion or more of these bacteria and viruses, and they actually outnumber the human cells by 2 to 1, perhaps sort of 9 to 1. There's some evidence that definitely most of the cells in our bodies are actually bacteria. And in fact, we may actually only consist of 10 to 20% human cells. Most of us are bacteria, and most of those bacteria live in the gut. So with that's kind of been absolutely ignored by anyone trying to treat a condition like this. If you're ignoring the gut, you're probably ignoring a vital piece of the puzzle. And there was a study that came out a few years ago by a group from Finland, and it published in the same journal that we published in, and they showed that, in fact, the gut bacteria as well, not just the nervous system, the gut nervous system, but the gut bacteria in Parkinson's are also altered. This one particular species, Privatolaceae, it's actually reduced by 80% in people with Parkinson's compared to people without. And this bacteria seems to probably have some beneficial roles in providing energy and short-chain fatty acids and whatnot for neurons in the gut. And then there's another kind of bacteria that, called Enterobacteriaceae, and it's increased in many people with Parkinson's, and the higher increase correlates with more severe Parkinson's. So this may be a bad guy bacteria that's, there in too high numbers, and then your good guy one, the Privatolaceae, that's reduced, and you want more of that. So just an example, these guys, this was a really cool study, and they showed that the bacteria in Parkinson's are different from people without. So the gut-brain axis is disturbed in Parkinson's. That's fact 2. Fact number 3 is the mitochondria are dysfunctional. Mitochondria are these little batteries inside all cells. If you have a neuron, and I've circled these little bean-shaped things, there's actually hundreds of these mitochondria in each neuron, and they produce all the energy, the vast majority of it for the neuron. Without them, the neuron would run out of energy and die. It couldn't survive. They're critical, and they're not just in neurons, they're in almost all cells. There's only very few cells that don't need them. Now, this might be a little difficult conceptually, but within each of these mitochondria, along the wall of them, is this thing called the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain consists of these 4 blue complexes, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the mitochondria, so they're all along these little mitochondrial walls, and there's a lot of these complexes, not just one. And basically, as electrons flow down this, energy is made at the end of this chain. And that's the energy that the cells need to survive and do everything. In Parkinson's, the first complex, if you look at autopsy studies of people with Parkinson's, the first complex is damaged. And it results in about a 30% impairment in energy production. It's about 30% impaired. And that may not seem like a lot, but if you think about neurons, which tend to be very long, spindly cells that can be up to 1 meter long in us, and they probably require more, they have greater energy requirements than just about any other cell in the body. They cannot sustain a 30% impairment. in their electron transport chain that's not good for them because they have such high energy demands, okay? So there's other reasons why neurons, they must be performing at peak capacity and they can't survive a 30% impairment. So a lot of people think that Parkinson's, maybe the neurons are partly dying because they're just running out of the energy. Okay, so we all want to cure Parkinson's. And curing it means slowing it down, stopping it, maybe even reversing it. We have levodopa. Okay, this is a wonderful medication. It's over half a century old. Nothing's really come close. Perhaps in some people who respond really well to deep brain stimulation, that can be better. But other than that, levodopa is still the king. And what it does, though, is it masks the symptoms, the motor symptoms, largely in Parkinson's, and it masks them very well for the first 5 to 10 years. It's called the honeymoon period when you first start it, because it's like the Parkinson's almost vanishes, the motor symptoms. Of course, it doesn't help the smell much, and it doesn't help the constipation much, and it doesn't help many of those other non-motor symptoms, but it does well for the tremor and stiffness and bradykinesia. Okay, but remember, levodopa, as awesome as it is, it does not slow down the neuron loss. The neuron killing process continues slowly. You lose about 1 or 2% of the substantia nigra neurons every year. Okay, so what researchers are trying to do, they want to cure Parkinson's, of course, and what has been done traditionally is tend to target the Lewy bodies that I alluded to at the beginning, and they tend to target the little substantia nigra. Kind of, in a way, not really paying as much attention to the rest of the neurons that are all involved, or the gut, or the mitochondria. And so, pretty big gaps, I think. Anyways, a lot of these drugs, some of them are trying to block alpha-synuclein. This is the main sort of component of the Lewy body. And with those things, they're trying to prevent new Lewy bodies from forming. It's still in very sort of early research stages, no major success yet. Vaccines have been developed that actually target and remove the Lewy bodies. Again, no impressive results yet. There's this other way that researchers have tried to tackle Parkinson's, which I kind of like actually, neurotrophic factors. They use a virus or something to insert these factors that actually promote the survival and growth of the neurons you already got in the substantia nigra. And I like that because it's kind of like trying to improve what you already have. Unfortunately, while there was some excitement over single-arm studies before, there's randomized controlled trials have now shown that there's really not much of an effect with this compared to placebo, so it's a bit disappointing. And of course, there are cell transplant therapies, such as stem cells. And the whole point of these is to replace the damaged substantia nigra neurons. And generally, that can be done with embryonic stem cells or fetal stem cells, which have ethical issues, of course. And that's been done for a long time, decades. The results are not terrific, obviously, either. And another way to get these cells is to actually get them from another adult and try and get them directly turned into neurons. And it would be nice if we could use the person with the Parkinson's themselves, take a skin cell and turn it into a neuron. At this point in time, this is still largely a dream, okay? So people are working on these therapies, we'll see. But none of them have really succeeded much. So why on earth would you use a diet to try and treat Parkinson's? I mean, that just seems crazy. If you told me 5 years ago I'd be involved in this, I would say you're crazy. Well, let's recall some of the essential features of Parkinson's that have tended to be ignored by many people, and I bet your neurologist, when they diagnosed you, probably didn't mention any of these three. It's a disease of neurons everywhere, throughout the body: gut, spinal cord, brain, autonomic nervous system. That's a big thing. The gut-brain axis is disturbed. The enteric nervous system is down. Most of those neurons are gone. already. Constipation is a big symptom. Some studies put it more common than the tremor. Loss of smell is more common than the tremor. And the gut microbiota seems to be altered. Something wrong with the gut living down there, which outnumber our human cells by as much as 9 to 1. Can't be ignored. And the mitochondria, the things that make energy for like virtually every cell in your body, they're dysfunctional. That cannot be ignored. These 3 facts are huge and powerful facts. They cannot be ignored. It is not possible to ignore them. If you're going to try and create a therapy to slow down Parkinson's, you got to slow it down before you stop it or reverse it. We'll be happy with slowing down. That's called a disease-modifying drug or disease-modifying effect. Remember, levodopa is a symptomatic drug, but it doesn't slow anything down. You want a disease-modifying therapy. If it's going to slow down Parkinson's, it's got to deal with those 3 facts. It's got to at least slow down or heal all the neurons, not just the substantia nigra. It probably has to restore the microbiota balance in the gut. Okay, get rid of some of the bad guys and increase the numbers of the good guys. Create some kind of balance, which, to be honest, this research is in such infancy. We don't really know what the ideal gut balance is yet. And of course, it has to improve mitochondria function in all your neurons. Drugs are awesome, but drugs are limited. They generally work on 1 or 2 targets. You know, you have a drug and it's sort of going for this receptor or that receptor, or it's doing this or that. And you know, Parkinson's, clearly it affects the whole body, all the neurons, the gut-brain axis, the mitochondria. You need a therapy that's multi-targeted in its approach. A diet changes you if you stick with it. It changes your metabolism. It changes the genes that are expressed in you. And it changes your physiology. It changes everything. It is only, compared to a drug, a diet can tackle all these 3 things. It can get to all the neurons. It can get to all the mitochondria. And of course, what you eat is what those bacteria in your gut eat. They eat the leftovers, the stuff you don't digest. So what you eat directly affects them. And of course, they're sitting right beside your gut nervous system, so they're going to affect it. The question is, what is the right diet? So, some people have said a low-fat, high in natural carbohydrate diet is good for Parkinson's. Here's our Parkinson's with all the neurons disturbed. Carbohydrates have been found to increase insulin release in the spinal fluid and brain. And so if you had a consistently high natural carbohydrate diet, maybe you can get more insulin. And the insulin, there's some evidence that it can increase your brain dopamine levels. And dopamine is the thing that levodopa replaces that's deficient in Parkinson's. That would alleviate the problems in the brain and spinal central nervous system, potentially. And then a lot of carbohydrates, the non-digestible parts they're called fiber, which you all know about. The fiber is really critical because the bacteria use that to make short-chain fatty acids that can be used by our cells in our gut, our human cells, as energy source. They need that. So maybe, a lot of people think if you give someone a lot of fiber, you can improve energy production in the gut. Maybe that's beneficial for Parkinson's. Might help the gut. Okay, so most of the neurons could, in theory, potentially be helped by a low-fat diet. And this is the diet that's sort of often recommended, not always followed, in New Zealand and other Western countries, okay? Now there's this other diet called a ketogenic diet that has its supporters. What is a ketogenic diet? It is a high-fat, a very high-fat diet, adequate protein, low-carbohydrate diet, very low carbohydrate. And when you stick with that kind of diet, even for a few days, your body sort of runs out of all of its glucose stores, which is called glycogen. And when you run out, then the liver sort of says, well, there's all this fat kicking around this person's eating, and there is no more glucose, and the brain must have energy. So the liver turns all this fat into these things called ketones, which are organic molecules that can be used by the brain as an energy source. And the brain does very well with ketones. And other neurons do very well with ketones. Neurons everywhere, and in fact, skeletal muscle, heart is a little different. But the heart loves fat directly. But anyways, many tissues in the body can survive well with the ketones instead of glucose, which is the usual fuel source on a high-carbohydrate diet. So some people think a ketogenic diet would be good for Parkinson's because remember that complex 1 defect we talked about? Ketones come along and they just bypass it. The ketones don't need complex 1 to make energy. They go straight to complex 2, and the electron transport chain, in theory, should be able to restore its energy production because the ketones do not need complex 1. Whereas glucose, energy from glucose needs complex 1. So that's very enticing. If that could occur in every mitochondria in the body, maybe you can improve the energy shortfall in Parkinson's, improve the symptoms. Ketogenic diet can also stimulate the replication and reproduction of mitochondria, and of course, if you do that throughout the body, that's going to increase your energy availability too. So the ketogenic diet is very compelling for a way to improve the mitochondrial dysfunction, which, in theory, could affect every neuron in the body. So now we'll talk about the study. That's the background. So we did this study last year with 47 people with Parkinson's. And it was a randomized controlled trial, which is a very solid kind of design, because what you do is you take half the group and put them on one diet and half on the other, and nobody gets the choice of who goes on what except for a computer program that makes the decision. And then you follow those people as they do the diet and see what happens to the Parkinson's. That's what we did. We wanted to see 3 things. First, to see if it was even possible for this to be done. I'll be honest with you, we didn't get grant funding. We got denied a couple times because people didn't think on the committee that people with Parkinson's could actually do this, especially a ketogenic diet. They said they don't think it can be done. So if we had just done that in this study, that would have been a really great result. That would have been a world first, really, for what the number of people and the length of time we did it. The second thing, we wanted to see if it was safe for people with Parkinson's. Okay, you put someone on a radically different diet, either way, and is that safe? So you always have to check that. The second, we wanted to see if either diet group improved in their symptoms, of course, the motor and the non-motor symptoms. And thirdly, this was the really important one, we wanted to see if one group did better than the other. So how did we do it? We did a single phase design. This is actually unusual. A single phase means everyone did the diet together at the same time. Very often with these kinds of studies, there'll be one person will start it, a couple of weeks later another will start it, a couple months later another 1 or 2 will start it. And the whole thing takes several years, like 5 years, because everyone's doing it at a different time, right? We did everyone at once, the whole work. So it was a bit more sort of intense for everyone, but that's a better design, because then you take out seasonal effects. Maybe if one person had done the diet during a time when certain foods were more available, and then another did it during, the first person did it in summer, second did it in winter when some of those foods are not available, that could be a confounding variable. So we did it all at the same time. It was a randomized trial of course, and it was for 8 weeks. We compared a low-fat diet, which was sort of our control diet because it was in accordance with the standard recommended healthy guidelines, against a ketogenic diet. And we had 5 visits at Waikato Hospital. A screening visit, a training visit, and then 3 baseline visits at week, 3 clinical visits at baseline, week 4, and week 8. At the screening visit, that's where we checked all the people interested in the study to see if they were actually eligible. And most were eligible. We actually accepted many people into this study. We had very broad criteria. Sometimes in a scientific study, they'll be looking for a very specific kind of person. So they'll say, okay, we want people with Parkinson's, but it has to be very mild, and they have to meet all these different criteria. And basically, only like 1 out of 10% of anyone who's got Parkinson's can actually enter the study. And no matter what your result is, it's only applicable to that 10%, right? But we didn't do that. We accepted almost everyone that wanted to come in, and that was good. We accepted very mild Parkinson's and quite severe. And I keep clicking along. And that means our findings here are applicable to many people, the majority of people by far, with Parkinson's disease. So we accepted age 40 to 75 years. 75 is getting up there. We were, people in their 70s, we were sort of questioned as to whether that might be too old. It wasn't. They had to have a definite diagnosis of Parkinson's. There were only 2 or 3 people. I wasn't sure if they had Parkinson's at the screening visit, so we couldn't let them enter because you had to be very sure that they had Parkinson's. And it doesn't mean they didn't have it, but we just had to be sure. MoCA score over 20. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MoCA, is a scale of cognition, and if you are over 20, it means you don't have dementia. If you're under 20, you may be getting into the dementia range. And we wanted, since it was a diet study, you have to go shop and cook and stuff. We needed to accept people that probably we're pretty sure would be able to do that. BMI over 18.5, so body mass index, that was very generous. If you know someone with a body mass index of less than 18.5, then tell them to eat more. Okay, so they're not eating enough. And people had to be able and willing to follow the diet, of course. They had to be able to speak and understand English. They had to be honing on stages 1 to 4. This is a scale of Parkinson's severity. Really, stage 5 is so severe that you are in a wheelchair or bedbound. Okay, so stage 4 is still very severe. Stage 1 is very mild. There is a stage 0, but that's where you have the Parkinson's you can't even tell the person has it. So we didn't want to take that. So we accepted a broad range of Parkinson's severity. Oh. And this was our sort of emergency criteria. They couldn't have some weird condition that I didn't foresee that would make it difficult to complete the study. Only one person met this, a fellow that had a heart infection that I diagnosed at the screening visit, admitted him pretty much right away to get that sorted out. But of course it meant he couldn't be part of the study. After the screening visit, there was a training visit, and this is where we had this device that many people in this room will have fond memories of, I hope. It's a blood glucose ketone monitor. And this is a way for people to measure the glucose and ketone levels in their blood. And they did this every night, every participant. And the completion rate was amazing. 98% of the recordings were completed. That's incredible. So basically it was a little jab finger prick every night, and then you take a little strip that's inserted in the machine, the monitor, and you just put a bit of blood on it and you see what your glucose is, and then you do the same for the ketones. And both groups did this every night. And this was really critical because this allowed the people doing the diets to know if they were in the right range, because we sort of said, well, if you're on this diet, you aim for that range, and on that diet, you aim for that range. And it also allowed you to know who's doing it really well and maybe who's struggling a bit. And I remember one fellow on the ketogenic group was still, he was really struggling to get his ketones up. And after a few days, I was like, can you just tell me exactly what you eat every day? And then, yeah. What, banana? And I was like, okay, banana has to go. As soon as he got rid of the banana, it was okay. So that just shows you one banana a day really screwed up the ketogenic diet for that. Okay, anyways, everyone measured these things every day. And the low-fat group, we were aiming for their blood glucose actually dropped pre-study because of all the fiber, but they were eating a lot of carbohydrates. So they were aiming for a high-ish blood glucose compared to the ketogenic group, and negligible ketones. They should not have been making any ketones because there would have been lots of glucose and carbohydrate in their blood to fuel their brain. So no need for the ketones. The ketogenic group, of course, we were aiming for a lower glucose because they're not eating hardly any glucose. And we wanted them to get into this thing called physiological ketosis, which is where the ketone levels, it's generally accepted to be somewhere between 0.5 and 8. Anywhere in there is really good. And actually, some people say around 1 or 2 is a sweet spot, like low-level ketosis. That's perfect. And so that's what we were aiming for. We were trying to get them above 0.5 consistently. We assessed the severity of Parkinson's with this really good scale, the sort of most impressive scale for Parkinson's, the Movement Disorder Society UPDRS scale. And it's good because it assesses all of Parkinson's, the motor and non-motor symptoms in their entirety. And we did this at all 3 of these clinical visits. It includes parts 1 to 4. Part 1 is the non-motor symptoms. Part 2 is the motor symptoms. Part 3 is an assessment of the motor examination by a neurologist certified by this society who has no idea what diet you're on. So that was Chris and Fred were our 2 blinded neurologists, and they assessed everyone the same way every time without knowing what they were on. And of course, remember those assessments, we did those at the same day of the week, same time of day, to within 10 minutes every time. And everyone, that's why you had to always come at the same time of day for your assessments. Yeah. We also looked at a bunch of metabolic variables, weight, body mass index. We looked at diabetes markers, the HbA1c, lower is better. And we looked at the cholesterol profile, of course. So triglycerides, you want lower. HDL, high-density lipoprotein, that's the so-called good cholesterol, you want that higher. And then we looked at LDL and total cholesterol. The LDL is sort of this guy called bad cholesterol in the last few decades. To be honest, that is quite debatable now. There's a lot of contention as to whether you want, too low LDL is probably not good for you. Too high LDL is probably not good for you, but I mean double digits. Somewhere in between is probably okay. It's a huge source of controversy. I don't know. LDL, I think the jury's out, but definitely you want your triglycerides low and your HDL high. We also looked at this thing called urate. And also LDL, which you mentioned. Higher LDL is often more Parkinson's. So in Parkinson's, it might actually, it may not be that. Urate is this other thing. You don't want this too high, but when it goes, it seems that people with higher urate levels actually have a slower rate of Parkinson's progression. Now that's very intriguing. So there's a lot of kind of excitement about this particular little metabolite. And basically higher means the Parkinson's seems to go slower. So you want it to be a little on the high side, probably, maybe. It's just a correlation. And we looked at C-reactive protein, which is a general sort of marker of inflammation in the body. So the ketogenic diet had a whole lot of fat, obviously, and it was a lot of butter, eggs. This omelet on the left has goat cheese, eggs, butter. It's a lot of fat. And the little chocolate-looking thing on the right, it's not really chocolate. There's a little bit of 90% Lindt dark chocolate in that, but it's mainly coconut oil with a smattering of berries. So we did allow some berries in the ketogenic group, but you can't have any of the big fruits on a ketogenic diet. It's difficult. If you look at the ratios of fat to protein to carbohydrate, they vary tremendously between these two groups. On the left, the low-fat diet, for 1,750 kilocalories, which would be about a 70 kilogram person, what they need every day, there was only 42 grams of fat, 75 grams of protein, 246 grams of net carbohydrate. That's the total carbohydrate minus the fiber. Okay, and on the right, the ketogenic diet, in comparison, 152 grams of fat per day compared to only 42. About 40% of that was saturated fat. 75 grams of protein, same as the low-fat group. And only 16 grams of net carb. That's very low. And 11 grams of fiber, so there's still some fiber. Very importantly, the protein had to be matched between the groups. You have to match the protein between the groups because protein interferes with levodopa. And because most of the people in our study were on levodopa, if we had one group with higher protein and one with lower protein, and the one on lower protein did better, people would just say, well, they did better because there's less protein, and that is absolutely true. So that's what made it so hard. That's why we had you eat this meal this morning, this meal this lunch, this meal for dinner, and again next days. And all the calorie boosters were so low in protein they didn't matter. Okay? It was all about matching the protein. And that made it harder, actually, than even a normal ketogenic diet or low-fat diet. So you guys did an even harder diet. We had regular emails every 2 days and online videos, which I think helped, where Deborah and I would get up and answer questions and answers for each group and sort of talk about how things were going. And try to create a bit of humor at times. Okay, the primary outcomes for the study, that's your bottom line, of course, was how did the Parkinsons go? From baseline to week 8. Now, of course, we wanted to look at people, like a person's baseline Parkinson score compared to their week 8. We wanted to see if they improve, of course. But in Parkinson's, there's a great confounding thing called the placebo effect. It's very powerful in Parkinson's, and that is when you expect to get better, just because you're entering a trial, you will get better. And it will affect you even physiologically to an extent. And so this has been actually a real problem for many of those other studies I mentioned about neurotrophic factors and whatnot, is when you have a one-arm study, everyone does the same treatment and everyone gets better. Well, they go, yeah, it's great, that treatment worked, but actually often it's just a placebo effect. So, while I was interested to see what happened in everyone from baseline to week 8, you know, it was good that most of the people improved quite a bit in the study. But what we really wanted to know was which diet group did better. Was there a difference between the two groups? Because the placebo effect affected both groups equally, because we played out both diets as potentially beneficial to the same degree. And we gave you the same interventions, the same length of videos. If you notice, those videos were approximately the same length every weekend. Same number of emails, same length of emails. We tried to make everything equal between the two groups, except for the diets themselves. And even the diets, the protein was equal. The only thing that flipped was the fat to carb ratio. So if one group got a little better, and then the other group got a lot better, as long as we've taken care of the placebo effect and it's applied to both groups, we know the difference has to be due to the diet. It cannot be due to anything else. We also looked at all those secondary metabolic variables I listed earlier. Okay, so what happened? You know, time to get to the results. So this is the participant flow. I know you can't read it. We started with 59 people who came to the screening visit, and we excluded 12. That's very good. A lot of studies exclude a lot more than that. We accepted 47 people out of 59 into the study. And we allocated the computer allocated 23 to the low-fat group and 24 to the ketogenic group. Now, 2 weeks later, before we even started the diets, we had 3 withdrawals. Just 2 of them were just random life events. One person had a medical condition just out of the blue before starting the diet, and another person had a family bereavement, a very serious one, before starting the diet. Both out of the blue, so they withdrew. And a third person called me the night before, and he just got cold feet. So he just thought he wouldn't be able to do it. That's fine. So we actually ended up starting the diets, 22 people in each group. The study was completed by 38. So after 8 weeks, 6 of those 44 withdrew. 3 of them were because of difficulties with the diet. 2 in the ketogenic group, 1 in the low-fat group. And we'll talk about that in a few more slides. So there were 9 withdrawals overall, 3 of them before the study even started, and of the 6 that withdrew after starting the diets, 3 of them were due to the diets. The people measured their blood glucose and ketones every night. The left graph is the glucose, the right graph is the ketone. Now, the low-fat group is the blue line for both of them. You can see that the low-fat group had a higher glucose than the ketogenic group and a negligible ketone level. It was basically close to 0. Perfect. Perfect. So their average glucose was probably around 6.4, about 6.4. And it was significantly higher than the glucose in the ketogenic group. The glucose in the ketogenic group was lower and the ketones were higher. Now you may look at those graphs and say that doesn't look too impressive, but it actually is quite impressive. Remember, although we severely restricted the glucose in the ketone group, your liver continues, it can make ketones, it can also make glucose. Your liver makes glucose all the time. It's called gluconeogenesis. And so that keeps the blood glucose at a fairly high level, but it was still well significantly below that of the low-fat group. Okay? It's hard to get your glucose really low for too long because you need a lot of time to adapt to such a diet, months or years before you can really get it super low. The ketone level, the average ketone level was 1.15, nearly 1.2 in the ketogenic group. That was, quite frankly, amazing. The range of physiological ketosis is 0.5 to 8. The sweet spot is often said to be 1 to 2. You're right in the sweet spot. Now, there have been a few single-arm studies and other trials where they use ketone supplements and things for Alzheimer's and whatnot. A lot of them, they're pretty happy to get, they often get ketone levels of sort of 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 1.2 in people that ethics committees didn't think could even stick to the diet. They were right in the sweet spot. It was amazing, okay? So well done. There's nothing more to say about that. So in terms of plausibility, we had an 86 completion rate for people starting the diets over the 8 weeks. Is that good? Well, let's compare it to epilepsy studies. In adults with epilepsy, single-arm studies, this was actually the first randomized controlled trial, to my knowledge, of a ketogenic diet in any adult with a neurological condition, not just Parkinson's. But single-arm studies in epilepsy show completer rates of 50 to 60% over 3 months, a higher dropout rate than we had. And they didn't have to be restricted for protein either. Okay, so very good completion rate. And also we did offer a 6-month extension, and 2/3 of the people in each group put their hand up and kept going. And we went for a couple weeks before we suddenly realized really funding just was not there. And so we had to pull the plug. Plus, I had analyzed the results by then, and I realized we had a good result and we should just take that. And yeah, basically almost everyone, 2/3 of the patients in each group were keen to keep going for 6 months. So pretty good. And of course, the low-fat group did maintain negligible ketosis, the ketogenic group, physiological ketosis. So the low-fat group neurons were running almost exclusively on glucose, single fuel engines, and the ketogenic group neurons were running on glucose and ketones. And hopefully some of those ketones bypassing the complex 1 problem. Okay, so they're like hybrid engines. In terms of safety, there were adverse effects, there always are. They were mild and they were different between the groups. In the low-fat group, the most common one was hunger. About a quarter of people had this one, and it wasn't getting better. In fact, it probably was a little worse by week 8. People were complaining of being a little more hungry. That's well known for a low-fat diet, actually. In the ketogenic group, this funny side effect, the most common one, was this weird, unexpected intermittent worsening of the tremor or slowness, the rigidity. So it intermittently worsened the motor symptoms, and that was just, that's never been described, obviously. And I don't know why that happened. I think probably because for the ketogenic group, everyone started this suddenly huge increase in fat intake, right? All of a sudden. And there's some evidence that your the dopamine produced by your substantia nigra, it actually can be sort of inhibited by that and transiently make the Parkinson's worse. I'm not sure why it happened, but it did, and it affected 50% of people in the first 4 weeks. But it was improving. It was down to 29% of people said that they experienced this in the last 4 weeks, and of those 29%, most of them, it was much less intense. So I think people were adapting to this radically new, different diet over the 8 weeks of the study. And again, I wonder what would have happened if we kept it going, because the trajectory was sort of improving there. Okay, so again with the adverse effects, most of the adverse effects in the low-fat group persisted or actually increased in frequency. Hunger was the most common. The ketogenic group, looking at all the rest of the side effects, actually most of them decreased in frequency. So I think people were adapting. And that number one side effect, that weird intermittent worsening of the tremor, and that it was actually so bad, it was the worst in the first week. And for 2 people in the first week, they withdrew because it was so bad. And I saw a video of one of them. It was pretty bad, and so no problem. It was so in some, at least 2 people, it was bad enough to result in withdrawal. And the one person that withdrew from the low-fat group was having organizational difficulties and financial difficulties. So those are the 3 diet-related withdrawals. Again, this adverse effect was improving in almost everyone by week 8. This is the real finding of the study. This is the most important finding. Okay, so both groups improved in their non-motor symptom scores. The low-fat group improved on average by 11%, and the ketogenic group improved by 41%. That is, to put it in perspective, 4 times better. So when you hear about a study saying, oh, this drug resulted in a 50% improvement, well, this diet resulted in a 400% improvement. It almost cut the non-motor symptoms in half. And not only that, the most improved non-motor symptoms, the top 5, were some of the toughest ones for levodopa to handle. Urinary problems, pain, fatigue, daytime sleepiness, and cognitive impairment were the top 5 improved symptoms. That's amazing. Levodopa struggles with all of those. It's good for some of the pain syndromes, others no. It's not very good for urine problems. It does not do anything for cognitive impairment generally. Fatigue and daytime sleepiness are notoriously difficult. You try and improve the person's sleep, but even then they're often still there to an extent. So this was an amazing find. And both groups improved in the motor symptoms. Parts 2, 3, and 4 are all about the motor things. Part 4 is the motor complications, actually, the side effects of the medications. But again, everyone improved by about 20% in both groups. So I think probably part of that was the diet, but part of it would have been placebo. Okay? So we can't talk too much about them, but The difference between groups in the non-motor symptom improvement is very impressive. For an 8-week study on a diet, that's very impressive. I can tell you the trajectory of the improvement in the ketogenic group from 0 to week 4 was sort of like that much improvement, and then that much in the second half. So it was increasing, and every single person in the keto group improved in their non-motor symptoms to one degree or another, every single person. Okay, so by week 8, the non-motor symptoms improved more in the keto group, 41% compared to 11%. And this really cannot be explained by a placebo effect. We made very sure with the design of this trial to ensure that the placebo effect was not going to muddy that interpretation. It had to be due to the diet. I cannot think of anything else it could have possibly been due to. Okay, it's very important because non-motor symptoms ultimately impair quality of life a lot more than the motor symptoms. And the non-motor symptoms that respond least to levodopa are exactly the ones that improve the most with the keto diet. And both groups improved in motor symptoms by about 20%, but we can't really make too much of that because much of it could have been placebo. What about the metabolic variables? These were interesting. The average person in both groups lost about 4.5 kgs of weight. Most people were kind of happy with that. The HbA1c, the diabetes marker, also fell. That's generally considered to be a good thing. One guy with type 1 diabetes, we accepted type 2 and type 1 diabetes into this study. We just kept an eye on the type 1 diabetes obviously more. One guy's HbA1c dropped from, he had the highest HbA1c in the study at about 85, and then it fell to about 65, a drop of 20 in 8 weeks, which is incredible. And he had to half his insulin dose as well. And there were 4 people in the ketogenic group who actually had to reduce their Parkinson's medications, 2 of them significantly. There was one person in the low-fat group who slightly reduced his medications. So quite a lot more levodopa, ropinirole reductions in the keto group, clinically necessary because the side effects of the drugs were becoming stronger, and I think they just didn't need as much. Regarding cholesterol, triglycerides actually, interestingly, did not change. To be honest, the triglycerides went down in both groups, but there was no difference between the two. They both went down a little. Now that's tremendous. So if someone says you eat a ketogenic diet, all that fat's going to raise your triglycerides, give you a heart attack. Well, no, they go down, actually. They certainly don't go up. The HDL, the high-density lipoprotein, that went up in the keto group. That's the good cholesterol. You want it high. It went down in the low-fat group. The LDL and total cholesterol both decreased in the low-fat group. They both increased in the high-fat group. Slight decrease, slight increase. Again, high LDL is associated with less Parkinson's. Is that bad? Is that good? Maybe a high LDL is good. Nobody knows. It's been demonized in the past for the last half a century, but now there are lots of people coming out supporting LDL and total cholesterol levels as actually being good. So it's a controversial. I'll leave it at that. The urate decreased in the low-fat group. Urate increased in the keto group. Higher urate equals slower Parkinson's progression. Arguably a good thing for the keto group. C-reactive protein did not change in either group. So what do all those things mean? Okay, the weight loss. When people have advanced Parkinson's, weight loss is generally considered to be a bad thing. Okay? Now, although we had range 1 to 4, some people with fairly severe Parkinson's, the average score in ours was around 2. So most people had mild to moderate Parkinson's. And most people were overweight, borderline obese at the start of the study. The BMI was in the high 20s. And even after the end of the study, after the 4.5 kgs of weight loss, the average participant was still overweight. So I would probably argue that the loss of 4 to 5 kgs for most people was good. Most people. The reduction in HbA1c, the HbA1c, the diabetes marker, did go down more in the keto group, but it went down also in the low-fat group. That's interesting. Like the low-fat group had all that carbohydrate. And yet, because of all the fiber, their HbA1c diabetes marker still went down slightly. The keto group went down more because they had no sugar coming in at all, virtually none. So both diets had a good effect on that. Regarding cholesterol, I think it's really interesting that the triglycerides didn't go rocketing up in the ketogenic group, which is what a lot of people fear. I think the HDL results on the balance would favor the keto group because it went up in the keto group. That's cholesterol you want to be high. The LDL and total cholesterol changes are debatable, as I said, but I'll tell you right now, if I had Parkinson's, I'd want it to be a little higher. And the urate, same argument. So what have we shown? We're almost there. It's definitely plausible for people with Parkinson's to stick to a low-fat or keto diet, a greatly modified diet in each case for 8 weeks. And again, if that had just been the study, that would have been publishable in a nice journal and a great thing. But we also know that it's generally safe. And we found this weird new side effect in the ketogenic group. Perhaps if we did this again, we should have a graded approach to introducing the fat. It was going to be a bit technically difficult to do that for this study, but maybe your body just needs more time to adapt to it, you know. If you're going from 30% of your energy intake from fat to 75% in one shot, it's a switch. And both groups improved in their motor, non-motor symptoms, but the keto group improved more in the non-motor symptoms. And it was a lot more. And that's the big wow finding, and that's why this article already has more reads on it than all my rest of my research I've ever done combined. And of all the 2,700 articles published by movement disorders, it's number 7 for interest. So a lot of people are interested in this and talking about it. And these between group symptoms, this improvement in non-motor symptoms, it cannot be explained by a placebo effect, which is a critical thing in the interpretation. What were the strengths of the study? We worked very hard to minimize assessment bias. Basically, I wanted to make a study design that was just going to be fair to both diets. I didn't care what the answer, if one did better or whatever. I wanted to make it fair for both. And so we minimized assessment bias through the single phase design, everyone doing it at the same time. Strictly enforced timing. As you know, you had to be there at the same time every assessment, and we assessed you within 10 minutes for all the questionnaires and all the motor examinations and whatnot. And also, remember I asked you to take your medications at the same time before each assessment, and the participants did that. I checked with statistics. There was no variation in the time they took their levodopa and ropinirole and stuff before the assessment. If that had changed, that would have messed things up actually, because if you took your levodopa 10 minutes before the assessment, it won't have an effect. If you took it an hour before, it'll be a peak effect, right? So if it's always changing, it'll mess up the assessment. So we know that that didn't mess it up, thank goodness. We used the most comprehensive Parkinson scale there is to do the assessments. We worked hard on the diet plans. A lot of keto diets, people use supplements and things like MCT oils and ketone esters, artificial ketones. We wanted to avoid all that because they're expensive, they don't taste very good, and I'm speaking from personal experience, and they can give you side effects, particularly gut side effects, again, speaking from personal experience. So we wanted to do away with that and make all the food for both plans available at the Pack and Save. I went through the Pack and Save, made sure every single thing was available there. And so you know, you can have the best therapy in the world, but if it's not practical for them to use it, then it's useless, right? We tried to make them simple. All the recipes were 6 steps or less. We tried, you know, I know that some of the meals were still a lot of time to prepare, but we tried to minimize that. And we tried to make them both affordable. Again, it's difficult. Tried to make them about the equal amounts of money to cost, both diets. It's difficult with the keto diet because some of the ingredients, people don't buy them as much, so they cost a bit more. But we tried our best. I think we did okay. I know some people had financially, you know, it was a little more than what they were used to spending. We kept the protein constant between groups, and that was really tough for us and really tough for the participants to stick to those meal plans. But that's why they were so designed like that, was to keep that protein constant. So now you know why. And we had a lot of multimedia supports, the emails and videos. I think those were helpful. When people try to start a modified diet, be it low-fat, ketogenic, whatever, on their own, one of the greatest difficulties is mixed messages from society, and even friends and family, and even other doctors. They'll say, well, why are you eating that ketogenic diet? It's going to make your cholesterol go into the hundreds and you're going to have a heart attack. Well, you know, so when you hear that, then you start thinking, well, maybe that crazy neurologist I spoke to 3 months ago, maybe he is crazy. And yeah, I should just go back to what I'm used to. So with the videos and that, we're able to keep reinforcing why people are doing this. If you don't know why you're doing a diet change, it won't work. You won't, if someone tells you to do it, that's fine. Maybe you can do it for a while, but at some point you need to have a reason. You need to know why you're doing this. There has to be a good reason, because there will be times when you're tempted and when you're out socially or whatever, where you just, you know, so we tried to give you the why. There were 2 weaknesses, major weaknesses. So although 47 people does seem like a lot, and it is a lot for a single center, it's still too small to draw definitive conclusions. We'd need a study of over 100, at least 100, before you can start saying, okay, this is real. So that being said, the non-motor symptoms, remember, they did improve in every single person in that keto group. That's pretty strong. And although 8 weeks may seem a long time, actually, for a medication, that might be pretty good. Like levodopa, as you know, if you take it after a few days, you know if it's working or not. But for a diet strategy, remember, a diet potentially changes everything. Changes your neuron fuels, which changes what, you know, your metabolism is doing, changes your mitochondria, changes what genes are expressed. I haven't even had time to get into that one. And probably something like that needs more than 8 weeks before you are getting to, you know, the real optimal effect, probably months or even years. So it was pretty short for a diet trial. If we ever do it again, we need more people, more time. So again, the main finding was that the keto group showed a greater improvement in non-motor symptoms. That's a big finding. Because it suggests maybe the best thing is to combine levodopa with the keto diet. Levodopa is great for the motor symptoms. The keto diet deals with the big elephant in the room that levodopa can't deal with. It's exciting, it's promising. I think it's amazing it came from Waikato. But we do need a larger, longer randomized controlled trial before we can sort of be really confident about these findings. This is a quote I put up, I think in my first talk a couple of years ago. And it might have been, yeah, it might have been at the Hamilton Parkinson's meeting. Death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside of us while we are still living and never surrender. And the participants in our study never did. They never surrendered. They kept going. And that's what's really resulted in this fantastic result. So I thank you all. you.